Hello and welcome to Your Average Bear Gaming. I am George. Today we talk about one of the 8 different techniques that combined I call quick paint techniques. If you haven't seen one of my videos before, quick painting is just what I call speed painting plus, right? So speed painting gets your models tabletop ready. The plus means you do something a little bit more than that to make your models stand out without, trying to get to that pro level of painting prowess. I certainly can help you with that, and it's probably going to take a long time for you to figure that out. So in the meantime, you get to create models that look really nice without spending a ton of time on them. I decided to create this video series because in my normal painting videos, I find myself talking about these techniques over and over and over again, and it makes my videos way bigger than they have to be. So in these videos, I'll talk about one technique at a time, I'll explain it in detail, and if I talk about them in my future videos, I'll link back to this one, so if you want more details, you can have them at your fingertips, but you won't need to listen to me drone about this technique at length again. This one is less of a technique, more of a critical step that you have to take to make your models tabletop ready and making them look a little bit better than the average. I'm talking about basing. So there's lots of different ways to base a model. Some of it is pretty simple, some of it is more elaborate. It really depends on what you're looking for. Now, I am not a basing expert. There's plenty of other YouTubers out there that can give you detailed instructions and wonderful ideas on how to make amazing looking bases. This is not that video. This is the video for those of you who know you have to do your bases, but you kind of would rather move on to the next model, but you're going to do it. You want to do a decent job, but you don't want a lot of muss and fuss. Well, you're my people. You're the people that I want to talk to. So for a quick painting base tutorial or basing tutorial, you're going to need just a relatively few things. Bottle of wood glue, doesn't matter what you get, I don't think, but I use this guy. A little container to put it in. One of these handy dandy little sticks to both apply the glue and spread it around. Some basing material, ideally with various grits. And if you want to make it a little fancier, a little bit of air-dried clay bits or other kind of larger kind of terrain features that you can sprinkle on the bases. We'll take our wood glue and add a decent amount toward a little container here. I use glass because it's easy to clean and it generally doesn't get stained or whatever. So I apply the basing kind of material, the grit, before I prime the model. I find it much easier to get this stuff on to the model before I prime for a number of different reasons, but a lot of it has to do with getting glue and material on the model itself, like those little leg parts. But also it's easier to match the colors. So if you prime the thing before you add this sand or grit, you'll find that the tones of the material here and the model are vastly different. So if you want to have kind of similar tone or to make it look like they came from the same step, you want to make sure that you prime your model and your terrain at the same time. Your mileage may vary and sometimes you want them to look very different, so that's okay, but for the quickest results, make sure to remember to apply your basing junk before you prime the model. No one will die if you forget to do that, though, just FYI. So we get some of our wood glue and we apply a generous dollop on our spreader. I use this spreader, but you could use any number of variety of tools for this particular job, including toothpicks, an old ratty brush, coffee stirs, whatever. I use this tool. I like it because it has a couple of different heads. Like you have this wide spatula applicator, and then you have this other side that's kind of more narrow for more precise work. It's fine, but it's probably not worth the $5 I paid Games Workshop for it. A coffee stir will do just fine. All right, there is our model. It has the glue on it. Now that the base is ready for our grit material, get yourself a nice assortment of grit material. I use this stuff by Huge Minis. It works really well, and it's pretty uniform. But you don't have to go buy stuff. You can always go out and get stuff out in nature if you're inclined, or if you have ready access to nature. I don't really, so I just buy these things. And so here I have a variety of grits for this basic material. You can kind of see there, and you can kind of see there. And I like to vary the grits of my material, so I'll put a couple of big boulders in there, very kind of sparingly, kind of like so. It's here where if you have other bits like maybe enemy heads or skulls or alien crystals or anything like that, if they're relatively big, here's the step where you put them on, because you want to go from biggest grit to smallest grit, kind of in that order. We've got the second step here, so we've got those on there, and we'll sprinkle some of this on. If this is my medium grit material, and you can vary how much of that you put on there. You can make it all medium, you can make just a little bit medium, and the rest of it fine. It doesn't matter. Use whatever techniques you want. I kind of like to make each of the bases, if I have like a unit of models, I like to have a little bit of difference. So some of them will have more medium grit than others. Some of them will have more of those big chunks than others. And so here for this really fine stuff, since the glue is still very, very wet, I'll just dip the model in the container, kind of like so, and then shake it out, shake it out. Every part of that base that didn't have a large or medium grit terrain stuff now has at least fine. And at this step, I'll wipe the base kind of like so. And there you have one moderately based model. It's not too shabby. It's not going to win you any awards, but it's not going to slow you down either. With this next Terminator model, I'm going to show you a slight variation on the very same technique with just a little bit of extra stuff. So I'm going to put down my glue, and it doesn't have to be uniform. In fact, it's probably better that it isn't. A little lumpiness on your terrain, on your base, is going to give it more visual interest, although it'll tend to flatten out over time. If you really want lumpiness, then you probably want to add other material, but that gets into, getting fancier, and ain't no one got time for that, at least not at this channel. Now that the glue is all on the base for this particular Terminator model, I've decided to add some additional stuff. So instead of those big rocks that I showed you before, I'm going to use this. This is some air clay. And this air clay, before it looked like this, looked like this. This is a bag with air clay. The brand doesn't matter. They all work about the same. The idea here is that it's clay that you mold and then you let it dry in the air, no baking required, and it becomes firm, it becomes hard. At least it becomes stiff. It can be a little brittle, but for our purposes, we want it brittle because we're going to take this pattern that I got by pressing that air-dried clay into this terrain piece. This comes from some terrain piece I bought off of eBay. It's supposed to make these crates, and I bought them specifically because they have this texture that I can use to create stuff like this. So I've never assembled this. I don't intend to assemble this because it has all these delicious looking textures that I hope to one day make into these little air-dry clay things. And so I take little chunks of this textured stuff, so like that, and I apply it right on the glue. That way it looks like my Terminator is going to be walking through some ruins that have fallen, kind of crumbled around him. And to complete the look, I'll take some additional basing material, like this medium grit rock. And I make sure to apply a nice thick coat of it anywhere there wasn't a chunk of that air-dried clay. And then I wipe the rim of the model to make sure I don't have any weird lumpy rims. Nobody likes a lumpy rim. And there you have a nicely based model. This third variant I want to throw out there because it's just a variation on the previous things, except that instead of putting in chunks of air-dried clay or these large rocks from our purchased grits, I'm going to use these guys. It's a box O skulls. If you're a Warhammer collector, builder, painter, gamer, and you don't have a bunch of skulls lying around it, are you really even trying? I don't know, man. I don't know. But you can take these and sprinkle them all over your base. Kind of like so, and then finish off the rest of it with the other basing materials. Here I've got some medium grit, and here I have the fine grit to finish off this whole kit and caboodle. And now our awesome Termy is ready to strike fear into the heart of his foes with those crazy looking skulls on his base. I've given the Assault Terminators a quick prime. As you can see, this is a Zenithal prime. The first prime was black, and then it was overlaid with a skeleton bone for later painting stuff, but since this is a video focused on the bases, we'll have a quick look at what they look like after they've been primed. It's about what you would expect. It's mostly the last color that we used, but there's a little bit of shadow that probably won't make it into the final product. But that's okay. We'll be adding that stuff through the painting process. And it's fairly, I would call it quick and dirty, but it's not really dirty. It's just quick. It does a pretty decent job of getting this painted and ready for the tabletop. Once you've built the base for your model, you're going to want to paint it. And painting your bases follows most of the same steps as painting your models would take. In other words, you have to lay down the base layer, you have to add a wash, you probably want to do some dry brushing, and then you want to go in there and add some detail. The very first step in that process is to add the base layer. And this could be either just a plain old layer paint, fully opaque, or it could be a base coat glaze the way you use them for your models, or the way I would use them for my models if you don't happen to use the quick painting techniques that I've talked about in my videos. It all boils down to the opacity of the paint. In other words, do you want to be able to see the base coat underneath, in this case the primer? Well, if you went through the trouble of applying a zenithal prime, you probably want to do that. And really, depending on how you built it and what's on there and what the rest of your model is, you could decide to go either way. Typically, I go with a base coat glaze, usually a medium-bodied base coat glaze, and that does a really nice job of providing some adequate coverage while still letting some of the highlights from the undercoat show through. Highlights if the undercoat is a light color. The second step to painting the bases is to apply a wash. Once the base coat has been dried, you want to go in there and add a wash. Now, you can take a couple of approaches with this as well. Sometimes you want a lighter wash, sometimes you want something thicker and darker. So you're going to need some practice with your washes, right? If all you've ever used is, say, for example, Citadel Colors Null and Oil, you may not know that Army Painters does a really good job of collecting in the crevices, gives you a darker tint to your models, etc., etc. And the vice versa is also true. If all you've ever used is Army Painter or Vallejo, you don't know what the other products, how they differ and how they can have their own uses. So I encourage some experimentation here. But for the bases, I typically go for a darker coverage. I tend to want my bases to be a little bit darker, at least after the wash. The third step in painting your bases is the dry brush layer. You don't always need this, but I recommend that you almost always do it. If you don't do this, make sure you're doing it for the right reasons, right? Do it because you want a darker version of this base, or it flows with your model better. Whatever the case, just make sure that you're doing it not because, I just don't want to. Because dry brushing the base, particularly if you've added some texture to it, like I've shown you, it makes a huge difference on the way your model looks. It really does. It's really easy to do. You're just, making sure that your brush is dry, and then you're rubbing the surface of it. Sometimes you want a light touch, sometimes you want a heavier touch, other times it's going to be in between, and all of that is fine. Experiment with it and vary your brush strokes according to the needs or the looks that you want to accomplish on your base. But almost always I recommend doing that. And so the dry brush typically is a lighter shade of color. So if your base is a brown base, then you went in and washed it with a dark wash of brown, and then you want to go in and dry brush it with a light brown. Similarly, if you have like a dark gray base, etc., etc. But sometimes you can flip that recipe around. Like sometimes you want to have a light wash going over stuff, and then going in with a dark dry brush. I can't think of a situation where you would want to take that approach, but creativity knows no bounds. Maybe that's exactly what your model deserves, so do it that way. The fourth step in this painting process is the detailing phase. This is a phase that you may not need to take depending on how you've built your base. If you have a couple of skulls here and there, you might want to pick those out with a different color depending on what color your base is, but a lot of times just a dry brush is going to be enough. But sometimes you have rubble, sometimes you have bits of concrete, sometimes you have an odd I-beam here and there, and so you do want to pick those out with some extra colors. And so I typically do that after the dry brush phase. I should also keep in mind that I typically do this once the model is painted. In this case, I haven't done that because I'm trying to show the process of painting the base, but for the most part, I would make sure to leave all this stuff towards the end because it can interfere with the painting of the model, which is really the king of the show. The base is there just to provide some context and a little bit of a story for where the model is located. But if you have these details, go ahead and pick them out, and you would use the same kind of approaches as before. Base coat glaze, washing, and dry brush. If you take your time with these little details, the returns will be sizable. The penultimate step in painting these bases is the foliage. I almost always add foliage to my models. It just adds a certain something that I can't seem to replicate with other things. I think it has to do with the vibrancy of the colors of the foliage that I've been using, or maybe it's that it stands up off the base, giving an additional three-dimensional space. I don't know what it is, but my models of late have just felt really incomplete without like a grass tuft or two here and there. Even for most bases, even if your base is completely rubble, a tuft of grass will find a way. So even if you don't think it needs it, I would put some tufts of grass in there here and there. There's a few situations where you absolutely don't want it, like if all you want is sand on your base, then okay, but you can have some tufts of grass and sand as well. I recently did a base that was lava. It was a lava base. There, I didn't use any foliage because there's no way I can justify, in my mind, having grass, even if it's burnt to a crisp, on, molten lava. But it suffered for it. It really did. So there's that to consider. Pick out whatever brand of grass tufts you want. I have my favorite, but pick whatever you like, and usually they're good to go right from the box, but sometimes you have to add a little bit of super glue to make sure that the join happens and it stays in place. Again, I really would caution you to leave this step towards the very end once your model is completely painted, because those grass tufts are going to interfere with painting at least the lower extremities of your model. very last step is to rim the base. I typically use a black paint and just go and coat the entire rim of the base with this paint. Since I use glazes, I typically need 2 coats to make sure it's nice and even. And so your mileage may vary depending on how you do that. But you always want to have some paint on the rim of your model. It leaves a very clean looking result. Now, some people will tell you that black is the only acceptable color. While I happen to sort of agree, there's plenty of people that are way smarter than me that disagree. I can see a wonderful case for having different colors of rims for different units in your army. Ultimately, it doesn't matter. It has no impact on the gameplay. It only has an impact on how your models look. So pick whatever approach you like. Or you can always subscribe to the Henry Ford model, where you can get any color of rim you want as long as it's black. Alright, here are my based models. They look a little weird because they're not actually painted. I've only done their bases here because that's the purpose of this video. But if you bear with me, if you just look at the bases, they look pretty decent. These bases have all the elements that you would think of that you would need to make your model tabletop ready, and it pushes it up just a little bit so that your bases are a little bit more impressive than the average that you see out there without spending a ton of time. With just a few quick, easy steps, I've been able to introduce a bit of variety while still having a unified theme for the entire unit. If these are game pieces, this is all you need. If these are art pieces, then you absolutely want to have some elevation and some modulation and the height of the model. But for your run-of-the-mill models, you want to use for your tabletop Warhammer 40k game, or if you simply don't want to spend 10 hours creating a base for your minis, this technique, this approach, it'll get you there. I hope this video taught you that having a decent looking base doesn't need to take a ton of work. If you enjoyed this video, consider giving it a like or a subscribe. Stay tuned for a few more just like this one. They should be educational. Thank you very much for watching. Have a wonderful afternoon. Be nice to yourselves and each other. Peace.